Okay, so thank you, Michael, for being with us this afternoon for us and this very early morning for you. So you see that we have 17 students that are making PhDs in France and also in Belgium. And I'd like, before you start your conference or lecture about the role of behavioral psychology in affecting the perception of risk in structural health monitoring decision making, to read for the students your the short video that you sent us, so that they are aware of all your expertise in the field. So I will read it for you. I think you have it in the booklet because I don't speak very well English, so you can correct my spelling or my speaking. So my paper is with diplomas from Duke University in the USA, from the Department of Mechanical Engineering and Materials Science. He then was a research engineer and section head of the United States Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., USA. And in 2003, he joined the Structural Engineering Department at the University of California, San Diego, where he currently serves as Professor of Structural Engineering. So you may certainly publish papers pretty soon, but my paper has already published over 450 papers and proceedings in his research areas, which are in applying nonlinear time series techniques to structural health monitoring applications, adapting Bayesian inference frames for optimal decision making in SHM, developing ultrasonic interrogation strategies for aerospace structural assessment, optimizing sensor networks for various SHM limited performance measures, developing RF-based sensing systems for structural assessment, creating real-time shape reconstruction strategies for highly flexible aerospace and naval structural systems, and designing and testing fiber optic measurement systems for many structural applications. So you remember on Thursday we have a special course and exercise on Posterior interferometry and optical fibers. So maybe we'll hear about that today, but you will hear about that next Thursday. So Professor Todd won the 2005 Structural Health Monitoring Person of the Year Award. He was named 2009 Benjamin F. Meeker Fellow at the University of Bristol, UK, and won in 2016 the 2016 Society of Experimental Mechanics D.G. Michael Award for contributions to research and education in experimental mechanics. He serves as a management editor of Structural Health Monitoring, an international journal. So maybe some of you will find papers for review. So really, Michael, we are very pleased to have you this afternoon and this morning for today. And please, you can start your talk, and I will try to stop my mic for you to speak freely. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. So good afternoon to everyone. As she said, it's very early in the morning here, so my apologies if I'm a little bit slow. It's only 6 o'clock. So I wanted to say a couple of quick things before I started on this. I noticed in the course schedule that a large part of your curriculum tomorrow on Wednesday is about decision analysis and utility theory and some of these topics that are very important in decision making. So my point is that it might be that some of this lecture is a little bit out of place in the schedule. It could have been, I probably should have asked to go later in the week and present this a little bit later in the week, but nonetheless, it's okay. We'll do our best. And I guess the second point is, this is probably going to make the students happy, but this is not a 2-hour presentation. I I wasn't sure how much time I really had, so it's definitely well less than 2 hours of talking. But if you have any questions, of course, we can discuss them after the talk or during the talk. I don't mind being interrupted if I'll ask someone in the room to make sure I see, because it's kind of hard to watch the screen and see what I'm talking about and look at the classroom at the same time. So anyway, with that, I guess I can start. And what I'm going to talk about today is in the broader context of decision making, where we use a structural health monitoring system or even just in human inspection data to make some kind of assessment of a structure. At the end of the day, a human being, an inspector, usually is the one that has to carry out the decision, whether it's to perform maintenance or to do some other action as a consequence of the decision. And what we were trying to do in this work is model the influence of the decision maker, the human decision maker, because we as human beings have perceptions of risk and biases that can affect our decisions. So even though, so for example, if one of every single one of you in the class was handed some structural health monitoring data, I'm willing to bet that all 17 of you would have a different idea of how serious or not serious the consequences of that data are, right? Everybody has a different perception of what the risk is associated with certain presented information. So that's what we're going to try to talk a little bit about. And it's a very early work. This is work that's we've just started to publish. So there's a lot of open-ended questions and opportunities for doing this differently. So basically, I wanted to start off with a couple of comments. In America, there was a vision for civil engineering, for the infrastructure published, where the engineers, so these are people like you and me, rely on and leverage real-time access to living databases, sensors, diagnostics, and other advanced technologies to ensure informed decisions are made. And so that was a charge of the Professional Society of American Society of Civil Engineers. This was something that they wanted the entire civil engineering community to be embracing within just a couple of years. This vision was laid out maybe 15 years ago. And so decision-making, formal decision-making in infrastructure management has become a very active research topic. So what we'll sort of talk about today in this context, or these two objectives, we'll talk a little bit about exploiting and enhancing expected utility theory to automate and rationalize maintenance decisions that take into account, no, I wouldn't say all. I said all in this presentation. We never account for all of the uncertainties, but perhaps the primary uncertainties and the consequences of making decisions. Good decisions cost you some money. Bad decisions cost you some money. So that should all be part of the framework, right? And then secondly, we'll talk about how interpreting, and this is what I already said, but interpreting decisions made by an SHM system that are supposed to be used for making those decisions are biased based on the perception of the risk presented, right? Humans inevitably have to take these decisions, make these decisions. So we are biased, okay? So we'll talk about how to account for that or model that. Okay, so in some sense, what we're trying to do is, given a structural system, and I have a specific one in mind that I'll share with you shortly, sources of uncertainties and measurement data from some kind of SHM system, how do we obtain an optimal maintenance strategy, okay? So first we'll talk about the framework, decision making. And again, I think you are going to get some training tomorrow all day in formal decision making. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing that because you will receive a full course tomorrow if the schedule is correct online. I'll introduce our structure that we will apply this framework to, okay, which is a miter gate, part of a navigation lock. And then we'll show some simulated results over the life cycle of a miter gate, because while we definitely have data from miter gates, we don't have it over the whole lifetime of a structure, so we don't know what's optimal. So we have to induce some simulation into our process at this point, where we evolve. We have some kind of evolution of the failure modes and are able to simulate what the future looks like over the whole life cycle. And then we'll show you the impact of decision-making, people's risk perception on their decision-making in the maintenance of this miter gate. So essentially, we have the structure, which I'll spend about 3 slides on. We have a state parameter. So we have some set of parameters that govern the state of this structure, right? Maybe it's parameters that quantify the damage of interest. And in this case, what that parameter is primarily going to be, as I'll show you in a moment, is the loss of contact at the bottom of the gate between the coin block, the concrete wall, and the steel structure. That's a major problem. So that's the parameter in this space. We have a prior distribution, maybe some previous information, or maybe it's completely uninformed, right? We might know nothing, and we would call that an uninformed or prior, but we might have some prior information on the history of that gap based on other gates, miter gates, or data or previous inspections. And then we have the space of information gathering systems, which basically is the space of all possible ways you're doing SHM inspections, whatever is allowed under the constraint of the problem. We have the data itself. More generally in the structural health monitoring community, we speak about the features, right? We use computer science language. So it might be data coming from sensors, but often we transform that raw data into whatever it is we're going to use to make decisions. So we call those features. And then we might have we would use something like Bayesian inference. There could be other techniques, but in our case, we like Bayesian approaches. We use Bayesian inference to find a posterior distribution of the state parameter that's conditioned on those measurements. And of course, there are lots of sources of uncertainty, both in the loads, the operational environment, the atmosphere. There's a lot of sources. There's measurement noise. There's other sources of uncertainty. We will not be, in this particular presentation, accounting for potential modeling error, but that's a huge problem, and we're certainly aware of it, and many modelers are aware of how to use frameworks when they model to account for possible modeling bias, but I'm not going to worry about that in today's presentation. And of course, like I said, measurement noise. So those are some of the sources of uncertainty that can essentially make this whole problem, as it will be presented tomorrow, probabilistic, not deterministic, but probabilistic, okay? Because there are many possible realizations of how a life cycle will evolve and what the consequences and decision tree analysis will give you. Okay, so I wanted to first talk a bit about the structure, what the actual problem is that they care about. So in the United States, for whatever reasons, I don't know all the reasons, but they're historic, the United States Army is responsible for the entire country's inland waterway navigation corridor. So you see lots of different rivers in the United States interior, mostly in the East Coast, but a few in the West Coast. I'm way down here in San Diego in this lower left corner, and believe me, we have no water down here. But the rivers are managed by the Army, okay? And you see there's a lot of different corridors, networks of connected rivers to transport goods throughout the entire navigation system. Here's one example of the Ohio River, which is right here. I think, hopefully you can see my cursor on the screen. I'm drawing it. This is the Ohio River. It's one of the biggest in terms of transportation of goods. And you see that along this river, every single one of these little yellow T's is a lock. Whoops, it's a lock. And what a lock is it permits the passage of ships through different elevations in water. The water goes up and down over mountains and so forth, as well as the seasons cause water levels to drop a lot or rise during flood season. And ships cannot simply traverse these rivers on their own power. They need help. And essentially locks are nothing but river lifts, river elevators, okay? So you can see here, there are a bunch of these locks along a corridor. And of course, there are many such rivers in the United States. So here's an example of a lock. So in this case, we see, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 12, 15 barges, flat boats, barges that contain, I think in this case, it's coal, okay? And here's a tugboat that pushes all the barges up the river. And of course, to get from one side of the river here to the other side, which is outside of the photo, these hydraulic pumps raise and lower the water level inside these big, large structures. In these gates here, here's a series of gates. They're mitered. That's the term of when they're closed like this. Here's an example of this lock chamber being dewatered. So the water was taken out of it for maintenance and servicing. In fact, that's me right there. During an inspection, we got to go down and work with the inspectors to see how what the damage state actually looked like prior to servicing. But the problem ultimately becomes that these gates, if they have to be dewatered, meaning they're taken out of service, okay, it's $3 million per day, per gate. So if there are hundreds and hundreds of gates, the worst case could be billions of dollars per day, which is unacceptable. So they are very concerned about keeping the gates operational. And that's what the motivation is for managing the asset over its life cycle. The problem too, and I'm sure this is true of most civil infrastructure, is that governments don't always want to invest dollars that increase with the life cycle. And so the Army is facing flat budgets over its last 25 years and projected to go into the next 20 years. Not a lot of new funding is being put into monitoring. So they have to minimize costs. They're being given some fixed amount of funding to maintain. So they have to find optimal maintenance strategies. They really don't want to dewater these locks unless they have to. And they certainly, on the same way, they don't want the lock to fail because that would be an unplanned outage. And at least with planned outages, planned maintenance is about, the Army Corps tells us it's between 8 and 10 times cheaper on a per unit basis than unplanned failure. In the case of planned failure, they can usually direct all of the cargo operations to use a different river system or a different lock. Whereas with its unplanned, ships get stuck in the river corridor and they don't move the goods. So it's a big problem. Let's see. Whoops, somehow I'm getting ahead. So this is an example. This is the big gate. This is the concrete gate with steel facing. This is a very large arm that opens and closes the gate, okay? At the bottom of the gate, which is almost always underwater, we have what's called the coin block and the gate coin block. And this contact surface is where a lot of lateral load is transferred. And what happens is that repeated cycles of operation, natural corrosion, and other environmental effects induce a loss of contact here. So we start building a big gap between the wall and the gate, and it opens and closes, and it redistributes stress throughout the entire gate, which causes other problems. But what it tends to do is self-accelerate the process of opening the gap further because the loads are redistributed. So this is a problem because as the loads are redistributed, you get stress concentrations that cause the gate to yield and ultimately fail. So inspection, of course, is very challenging because, as I said, it's underwater. And the water in most of the river systems is extremely opaque. It's very turgid, very turbulent. And inspection is just by sort of normal methods, visual, other things simply don't work. And what they often have to do is send divers underwater if they really are expecting something is a problem. But what they have done is they have instrumented some of these gates with strain gauges in a distributed network with some concentrations along some of the load paths in the gate, so that they're hoping that the strain gauges can be indirect observers of load redistribution that could be as a result of a gap forming down there. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture on what's happening and the problem that needs to be solved. So to demonstrate the maintenance framework, we're going to try to make the decision analysis simple. So we're going to consider just a binary choice, two-choice problem. Either you don't have to do maintenance, so don't worry about taking water out of the chamber, or you do, okay? Now, I'm not going to precisely define the limit state yet, okay, other than you could have again, you'll learn about this tomorrow, but a hierarchy of decisions that might be somehow related to the severity of the inferred or measured damage, right? So for example, you know, possible associated maintenance strategies might be shut down, inspect, no repair, shut down and inspect, and then some kind of minor to extreme repair all the way to replacement. And most of those would have some corresponding level of damage that it's required to do that action. So this is the kind of thing that the business owner, or the structural owner, has to be able to convey to the engineer, okay? This is where ownership costs have to be known, or at least estimated, by the structural owner. And sometimes in civil infrastructure, certainly in aerospace infrastructure, this is often mandated or regulated by some regulatory or government agency, okay? In this case, what that break point is of when we should make a certain decision is not precisely known. It's historically been relied upon the expert of the engineers, the inspection engineers in the Army Corps. And that itself is a very stochastic, probabilistic kind of assessment. It's not based on a rigid limit state, okay? So at any given instant of time in the life cycle of the structure, then what we're asking to do is, given a posterior distribution of gap length, okay, given a base consequence cost of any particular decision and the risk perception of the engineer, which I'll get to shortly and explain how we're modeling, we want to label the structure, that's the computer science term, or decide the maintenance strategy equivalently, okay? So that's the big picture. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Bayesian inference. You know, this is not a structural health monitoring presentation, but Bayes' law is what we use based on conditioning our observations on prior information of gap, either through using a model or using past data. We can define a likelihood and then use Bayes' theorem to get that posterior. But on the decision side, the consequence side, we have to have base consequence costs, okay? Base consequence costs give the net consequence. It could be in whatever units you care about, money, whatever, of making a decision d sub I when the state is theta, when the state is given by theta true. Whatever that state theta true is, we want to make a decision d sub I, where I can be 1 or 2 in this case, or 0 and 1. There's only 2 decisions. And we know that decision costs, well, one thing we claim in this work is that decision costs at the extreme states are usually fairly well known, at least in this application, okay? So we can say that if there's no damage, essentially negligible or no damage, the gap is barely there or really not there at all, it has no consequence on, or no effect on the performance of the gate, okay? We sort of, and we know that that there's a certain cost with taking the decision not to do maintenance on it, okay? So there's some, essentially you could think of this as the cost of doing normal business, okay, when you're not damaged, all right? Similarly, if the truth parameter is at its maximum possible state, which in this case might be complete loss of gap, actually it's not. The engineers did tell us there's an upper limit of length of loss of contact where no matter, even if the gate is structurally still attached to the wall, there is no way they would operate it. And this was a policy, this became a policy of the entire core, and it's on the order of 300 centimeters. So if the gap is that big, and these are very big structures, so 300 centimeters is big, but it's not quite as big as you might think as a fraction of the gate length. But if it's much more than about 300 or 350 centimeters, they will always stop all operations and have to perform some kind of repair or replacement. So that's what we mean by theta max in this case. So there's a cost associated with that, okay? If you say there's no not critical damage, if you make the decision not to perform maintenance, and of course, as I'm saying, there's a max at which of course they would, but there is some massive cost associated with that, and that would be the cost of failure, unplanned failure. So, similarly, there are fundamental costs with deciding that you need to do maintenance when in fact there's no damage present at all. So that would be basically a false positive kind of decision where you take the gate out of service and you go down and you realize it was a waste of time to do the inspection. And then of course the cost here is you're approaching your max allowable damage and you actually decide to do something. And that's generally a known cost for repair or replacement. The difference between beta and alpha might be that alpha, since you made the bad decision, is there might be other consequence costs. Could be loss of property, longer downtime. It's hard for me to speculate, but they aren't necessarily the same, because if you make one decision, the consequence could be very different in cost than the other. And so, for example, if we know those endpoints, or even approximately, by the way, you can make those parameters themselves random variables. And we'll talk about that later. I won't do that right away, but that can be part of the probabilistic analysis. Maybe you don't exactly know, but you have a distributional idea of what those parameters could be. So if you realize, if you make one assumption that if you know these endpoints, damage intensity, in other words, the growth or the evolution of whatever damage parameters you're studying that are in this problem, the only assumption we have to make is that there's probably has to be some monotonic relationship. It's not generally true, I think we can all say, that as damage increases towards some critical limit state, that the cost associated with making a right or wrong decision should go down. Okay, I'm not assuming a repair here. Okay, that's a different part of the decision curve. If you make a repair, then you probably have a new curve as you start to the damage progress again. Okay, so in the absence of any maintenance, we make the assumption that somehow damage intensity monotonically would has a monotonic relationship with these costs. Okay, so here's the size of the strength, some kind of measure of the intensity of the damage or its nearness to a limit state. And then these are the costs. Okay, the consequences, just all we have to say is they have to be non-decreasing. They don't have to be linear. Okay, I show them as linear here in simple interpolation between those consequence costs. There is nothing in this framework of modeling that I'm about to present that requires that. Just for simplicity in this demonstration, I'm going to show that. But you can make it any cost function you want with under an increasing monotonic assumption. Okay, that might depend on understanding something about the loss or utility. That has to be worked out with whoever the structural owners are and what their business model is and what their regulation model is. But again, we're going to assume linear here just to make a point. Now, this is where human perception of risk and decision making comes in. Okay, I think we can all agree that the perceived consequences of a decision is subjective. It depends on the person who's responsible to make it. And so in general terms, an individual's risk profile is his or her willingness and ability to take on risks and help either him or her or the organization they work for bear losses and assume the consequences, okay, of making a decision. So we could generally, in a very general way, classify someone's risk tolerance into three classes of profile: risk averter, a risk seeker, and risk neutral. Okay, so a risk averter is a decision maker that has a strong desire to not make any incorrect decision that can lead to large losses. Very conservative. This would be a conservative type of decision maker, risk taker. Risk neutral maybe is somewhere between a risk averter, and then the risk seeker is someone willing to bet more and absorb higher losses with an expectation of the highest possible return on investment. And this is something, you see, I'm using words here to describe things that almost sound like gambling at the casino. Okay, and the fact is, a lot of these ideas that I'm talking about are taken from the econometrics world, okay, the economics world, where they model perception of risk for business decisions, stock market trading, all sorts of things. So it's a way of taking another field's advances and using them in our field of structural health monitoring. So you can be somewhere on this spectrum. Okay, any decision maker can be somewhere on this spectrum. And so one way of capturing the range of possible risk profiles is by what's known as a utility versus wealth or utility versus loss function. Okay, more generally a utility function. An individual's utility will sort of be a way to describe his or her evaluations of the consequences of a decision or action that they took. Okay, and the utility can be different from the actual posterior monetary cost or value. So if you're risk neutral, the black line, as I said, you don't buy, your decision is not particularly biased. You're pretty much in line with loss that equals utility. Okay. Risk averse people follow curves that look more like the red curve, and risk-seeking people, more risky people, follow the blue curve in how they perceive whether they're willing to take a bet on information presented to them or whether they're not willing to take much of a chance on information presented to them. Okay, so these curves, we were looking for a way to parameterize these curves and project it into sort of an understanding of base consequence cost. And so we assumed we found a functional form, a logarithmic utility that did this. So it takes two parameters. So there are two parameters that can be used to completely describe, at least in this model form, a person's risk perception. And so the utility of taking the decision of no maintenance, okay, given, you know, that you're on the alpha curve, okay, if you remember which curve that is, it's this curve here, all right? So you're in this space, the top row of this table of taking this decision. If you're in that space, this functional form where you see the costs here, alpha min, where the variable L naught, just a variable, can go anywhere between those two extremes. What this wealth versus loss mapping does is take that utility function and map it into the human risk perception space. And we do the same thing, a separate curve, for the lower half of the table in this binary space, okay? So a separate variable L1, all right? And so the parameters C and gamma, these two Greek parameters that are used to sort of tell you how much the curve bends up or down relative to neutral, okay? So if C is less than gamma, we have a conservative risk averter. If C is greater than gamma, we have a risk seeker, okay? So for example, I might look at 5 different profiles. I'm going to fix gamma. We're doing lots of studies of how these two parameters, what they mean in terms of risk, but they just change the shape of the curve. So I fixed gamma because the more critical thing to flip the curve between neutral, between risk aversion and risk seeking is the parameter C relative to gamma. So I picked several values on either side of gamma to generate different utility functions in both the top half of the table, which is the no maintenance, do not perform maintenance half, and the do perform maintenance half. Okay, so we have a whole profile of risk here that parameterizes how we transfer our perception of a decision consequence into what we want it to be, what we perceive it to be. Okay. So these are just 5 particular risk profiles. That's why I use the letters RP. So extreme risk aversion, so very, very conservative, very, very careful, very worried about decision making, to someone who's a big gambler, perhaps. They really like to take risks because they might be tremendous. On average, they think there'll be tremendous reward and they'll save a lot of money. In this case, it'll be more about saving money. You're not going to make money, but saving money is making money. If you're not taking the gate down for maintenance. So L hat denotes the consequence cost of making that decision by that decision maker when the true gap length is theta true. However, also there's a decision cost, a cost associated with developing and installing an SHM system. So if you have a particular SHM system, I'll call it Z, that's helping you infer the gap length. It's giving you a posterior of what theta estimated is, okay? There's a cost associated with that system and along with maintaining it, okay? So what that does is it goes from, instead of a cost utility, whoops, I don't know why this is, there it is. We can now map those two things together, the state space, theta, to our perceived consequence cost. Okay, it's now all mixed together by that mapping, and we can see in these how a particular risk averter perceives consequence costs as a function of damage level. Okay, of course, the reality is theta is itself not known. This is, remember what we're saying here. This is our perception given knowledge of what we think theta is. Theta itself will be provided by the SHM system as a posterior distribution. And our belief in that posterior, or our bias in interpreting that posterior, then gets mapped into these curves. Okay, so expected utility theory is probably the way they're going to teach you tomorrow as being the most common way of making a rational decision, right? So, you know, among the available set of all decision choices, pick the one that leads to maximum utility, or equivalently, if you write the problem differently, minimum regret, minimum loss, okay? So, for example, how humans then bias that utility theory. Let's say you bought an apple for $5. Why did you give it to your friend for free? Well, maybe this person likes to share more than make money. So instead of trying to sell it to somebody for $5.50, he gave it away for free because that made him feel good. I don't know. It's just a silly example to show you that what our behavior is not always following rational, strict utility theory. So that sort of biases what the perception is. And this is something that economists have worked on. Okay. So again, this is something you're going to see, I think you're going to see tomorrow from Professor Sorensen and others. So there's usually, if you have an SHM system, you first do a prior decision analysis when no new information is available. And then you can define the expected loss, okay, as the expected value of that risk modified utility function, okay? It could be the loss. We're going to write it in terms of loss, not gain or utility. We're going to write it in terms of loss, decision costs, perceived costs. So that's why it's the prior analysis is the expected value of that function. Okay, so the optimal decision is make the decision that minimizes the cost, right? That seems pretty straightforward. On average minimizes the cost. A posterior decision analysis, when new SHM information is available, it's the same idea, except now it's the expectation of our perceived damage state conditioned on our measurement system, our SHM system, okay? But it's the same idea. We still make the optimal decision by finding the minimum cost of that particular function, okay? So there's prior decision analysis, posterior decision analysis, and the right decision is the one that minimizes the total cost, okay? So these are the decision analyses. You'll probably see lots of decision trees tomorrow in your studies, but for example, you know, your decision is always in my simple example, do you do maintenance or do no maintenance? And then of course, there's a cost associated with that particular decision. And then there's a perceived loss or consequence of from that involves the risk, the human risk perception. If you have an SHM system, there are additional costs from the installation and maintenance of the SHM system. And it could be a different posterior because here's basically just prior information. Here's using Bayesian inferred posterior from SHM. Okay, so they're a little bit different, but it's the same idea in this whole process. So the way we're doing it, you know, we have the structure. Traditionally, what a lot of people do, of course, is they try to find a feature space that, you know, they try to find an optimum decision boundary in a data-driven space. Maybe they use machine learning or something to figure out what the right decision is in a deterministic way. And then, you know, if they're across the decision boundary, they make the label this or that. This is kind of what machine learning does, or traditional machine learning does. Here, we're going to be using it differently, as I said. We're going to use a model because we need to understand how gap growth over time that feeds into the whole life cycle works. And we're going to show that over time, how does cost function as a function of gap and then a gap over time affect global decision making. So we're pulling in Bayesian inference, we're inferring off of the SHM, and then we're putting an extra layer of risk perception modeling on top of the utility theory that's normally used in that minimization of total cost objective, which is what is done for life cycle management. So I guess we can show an example. So again, we have to simulate. Now we built a model over years that was validated on a gate, on an actual miter gate in the Ohio River. So as a gap was growing, now it didn't get all the way up to the maximum, but at the very least, we have it validated at some levels of damage over the life cycle. So we are confident that we can build a useful model that can predict strain, distributed strain throughout the gate as the gap grows, all right? So we're going to use the model to simulate the whole process now that we've spent some large amount of time validating its response. And so we're going to consider random upstream and downstream hydrostatic loading and random noise, uncorrelated noise added to all of our distributed strain measurements. So using that fundamental validated model, we're going to look at 5 points in time along the gap damage, okay? 5 different gap damage levels. So some would be early and some later in the life cycle. So the posterior, we use Bayesian inference on all this conditioned data. We found posterior distributions, basically found in our case through particle filtering. You could use sequential Monte Carlo. There's a lot of different ways to figure out how all these sources of uncertainty propagate forward into that posterior estimation of the damage state. We assume a uniform prior distribution, which basically means we don't have any information about the state to start with, okay? So it could be anywhere from 0 up to that 350 centimeters or whatever. Okay, so whoops, somehow I'm always going further than what I want. So if you look now at those posteriors, sorry, it's in inches instead of, but here are those 5 selected gap lengths, different stages of life cycle, all right, and their posteriors. So this might be the information presented to an inspection engineer. This is what we think the gap length is. The black point is the actual value, the underlying true value. The distribution is what the SHM system is presenting the decision maker. Okay, so you see there's lots of overlap, particularly in the higher damage states. And there's quite a bit of variation. So there is a true difficult decision to make here as the gap grows over time. Okay. So optimal decisions now. If I take those posteriors, I pick some numbers for the alphas and betas, the extreme ends of the cost. Okay, and those were provided by the Army Corps the Army. And then I feed it into 5 different risk profiles. I can look for all 5 cases of damage what the optimal decision is. Okay, I can see for different risk takers what the optimal decision is to do. Okay, and you see that an extreme risk averter always, in this case, says to perform maintenance in this particular choice of parameters. Whereas you become more and more risk-seeking, risk-bearing, you hold off on maintenance a lot longer, okay? Now, this is what I would call forward modeling. You find out what you parameterize the risk of the individual, then you find out what the optimum decision is. Probably the more powerful thing to do is if you have access to prior decisions from your organization, you can then turn around and characterize a person or an organization in terms of their risk profile and see how that would have affected or could affect other decisions. If we had just done prior analysis, only in the most extreme risk-seeking case would you not perform maintenance. So it's kind of interesting. okay, if we had no SHM system. So the SHM system, you can essentially use this kind of analysis also to see how an SHM system, whether it's bringing value to the process or not. So the extreme risk averter, RP1, avoids making any risky decisions and decides to perform maintenance in all cases of the posterior, even the low end, when there's almost no damage. And then it's the opposite for the risk seeker, except for case 4 and 5, which are pretty severe damage, actually, in the scheme of the problem. And so any organization like the Army consists of numerous maintenance action takers, right? It's not just one person, it's usually many. So we can have a spectrum of risk profiles. So the average performance of an entire organization is the average of its employees that are charged to make those decisions across all of the portfolio. And so we can refer to the distribution of the risk profiles as the organizational risk profile. Okay, so again, using those same 5 risk profiles, okay, what we're basically showing is if you take an RP1, an organizational RP1 type of organization, all right, then the critical loss in millions of, and this is again in units of millions of dollars, this is what the critical loss, this is the risk, what the risk profile would look like for a very risk-averse organization and a risk-seeking organization. You see how the shift moves where in terms of criticality depending on an organization's risk profile. Okay, so because an RP1 is more risk averse than an RP2, so it tends to conclude that the gate is damaged if you're risk averse at a much smaller gap length than ORP2. And so you see that the organization that's characterized by RP1 chooses to take no maintenance only in case 1, whereas RP2 will hold off even longer in time. On average, that would be the best decision for its risk profile. So, all we're doing is extending the idea of a risk profile of a single decision maker to a distribution of decision makers, okay? And turning that into some kind of measure of or optimizing over the entire space of loss over the damage. Okay, and so really, what this is doing is it's taking a rigorous theory, expected utility theory, and decision framework, and it's being used to select the maintenance strategy from a selected, predefined set of choices. Okay, but what it also considers is risk profile, how I or you or an organization perceive how the current state of the structure as presented by an SHM system or something else, what it actually means to you. Yeah, it's telling me it's 130 inches, plus or minus some utility. Well, I don't know what that really means. That scares me, or maybe that doesn't scare me. I want the gap to grow more before I actually make the decision to do maintenance. So that by reflecting that, we're putting an extra layer of modeling around utility theory. Of course, I spent almost no time today, because it's not the main point of this lecture, talking about how we did the model inferred inference of converting data to information of use. That itself is, a very common research topic, and most people are really moving toward Bayesian inference. I suspect you'll be hearing about that in some lecture this week. But we also want to point out the importance of behavioral biases. Okay, I think this research considers that fact that that different decision makers mentally assign different importance to the seriousness or urgency of a particular posterior bit of information. Okay, so the final piece of this, so that's adding that behavioral psychology shrink wrap, or if you will, around everything. And I remember I made the point 2 slides ago that you can sometimes use this framework, this value, use a value of information framework then to make a decision to quantify the net benefit of an information gathering system. Did the SHM system help you in some way or not? And some of your instructors at the school there are experts in this. And I'm sure you'll be learning a lot more about this VOI, value of information framework. So the idea is basically a structural health monitoring system is nothing but an information gathering system. And we gather information because it informs our decision making, right? We want something that's useful in informing the decision making. Now, of course, we all know that you can't just take information forever, right? So if we do that, it costs something. Oops, I guess, costs to gather and process. So the way we think about this in some VOI framework is to think about investment risk, right? I know I'm coming back to these gambling terms, but it's very similar to an investment risk, okay? So acquiring information bears a cost. And so the pre-posterior decision analysis becomes a framework comparing that helps the decision maker analyze the potential benefit, okay, without actually performing an experiment. So the traditional way that I think you'll learn about this week, the traditional way is that the value of information is best quantified in the traditional way by taking the total expected reward and subtracting off the investment risk. Okay, and so if the expected value of information is positive, that's a benefit, right? That's a net benefit. You want there to be more reward cost than risk cost. That's the traditional metric. We've been doing some work in actually casting this as a risk to reward ratio, which has some different statistical properties that I won't get into now, but it has some different behavior than the traditional metric. So the new proposed metric that we've been publishing on in the last year is the same idea as expected reward divided by investment risk. Okay, risk to reward ratio, not risk to reward difference. And there are some benefits, we think, to this in normalizing the values in such a way that don't inflate things inappropriately, because it's just a difference metric in the traditional way. And of course here, instead of positive, you want it to be greater than 1. The risk to reward ratio has to be bigger than 1. Okay. Some of the original works of Kelly and Shannon and others suggest that mathematically it is more desirable to maximize the geometric mean return per bet on investment than to maximize the arithmetic mean, because it maximizes terminal wealth, okay? Not necessarily static wealth, but terminal wealth. And that's one advantage of the risk to reward ratio over the risk minus reward traditional VOI metric, okay? So if we think of an SHM system as an investment portfolio, the cost of an SHM system over the life cycle is the risk, and the expected reward is by the pre-posterior decision wealth analysis, the terminal wealth, okay? So those are some of the terms. Whereas, the traditional way of doing it is a differential measure, and an SHM system that maximizes the traditional method is leading to what's known as the maximum arithmetic mean. But the risk to reward ratio is a normalized risk-adjusted return, okay? And an SHM design found by maximizing that one instead of the traditional metric leads to the maximum compounded savings over the life cycle of the structure. So we might argue that it could be a potentially better thing to use in the optimization strategy, okay? So let's look at a simple example to show what I mean. So which among the two SHM designs is more feasible? Let's say Z1. SHM system Z1 leads to an expected reward of $1,100 on an investment of $1,000 over the life cycle, whereas Z2 leads to an expected reward of $10,100 on an investment of $10,000 over the life cycle of the structure. Okay, so you see that the difference between these two in both cases is the same. Okay, right? $100. But the ratio is very different. Whoops, I don't know why this is always changing, but the risk to reward ratio has a different performance. Okay, normalizing out certain things. So what is the monetary? So the question that it becomes, is an SHM system worth using? And we're going to use the VOI analysis that I just presented to look at this. So what's the monetary advantage of installing an SHM system considering all possible realizations of the data for a particular instance of decision making? So there's the traditional VOI. Here's the risk to reward ratio. We know what the critical point is and whether it's useful or not. And then question 2 is installing an SHM system beneficial over the whole life cycle, not just at a particular moment of time in the life, but over the entire life cycle. Okay, and so we need all the things we talked about, right? We need all the things we've already talked about, plus the additional costs of the SHM system and its own operations and maintenance costs. Okay, so we're gonna even use the perceived utility function that we talked about on top of the VOI analysis. Okay, so these are how we build it up. You know, there's an expected reward, of course, savings, and then all the costs. All right, and then there's whether you put it in the traditional metric or the VOI metric. We want to minimize the cost over the life cycle. Minimize the cost in the traditional, or minimize the cost at the instant in time. And this is how this is, again, stuff you will see tomorrow, I think. But this is what happens when you talk about over time. You have to include discount factors and so forth as money changes value over time. Okay. And of course, the goal is always to save more than we spend. And so here we did that. We applied it to that framework. And essentially, what we're trying to show is comparing 4 different designs. 1, no SHM. Z1, acquired data using an optimized sensor network, okay, where we minimized life cycle cost. And then we looked at 2 other designs where we used 10 randomly distributed sensors, 20 randomly distributed sensors, because this was actually something the Army had done on their real structures. They hadn't cost optimized where they should put the sensors for life cycle because they didn't have this framework yet. Okay, so we were comparing 4 different designs. Here is where those design of sensors actually looked like on the gate. Okay, these are just different orientations of strain gauges, where they how they should be allocated on the structure. Okay, so with those designs, we had to have realizations of the life cycle. Okay, so we did. These are expecting all the demand on the structure, the probabilistic demand, all the sources of uncertainty. This was, we fed that into a gap growth model, and that's some realizations. For the prior design, this is the gap length over time. And this is what the perceived gap length is, but from using, or not the perceived, but what the SHM systems, the 1, 2, and 3 SHM systems gave as the gap length over time, okay? Plus their confidence profiles. So there's a true gap that was programmed into the life cycle simulation from possible realizations, and then there's the estimator, the inferred gap from the SHM system. So these are all our posteriors that we compare to put into the framework, okay? And so then we put in risk profiles, all right? Because remember, we need all those pieces to simulate the VOI metric. And so for each of the risk profiles, the expected cost savings over time, all right, look like this, all right? They look like this for the different risk profile using those same 5 risk profiles, all right? So that this, again, this is savings. This is savings over time. Forget what the y-axis really is. The number of values themselves don't matter because they can be adjusted to any particular problem. But you see that beyond a certain gap length value, meaning time, because we have a degradation model, we can now map everything to real time over the life cycle. Beyond a certain gap length value, the maintenance decision obtained using the posterior is the same as the decision obtained using the prior. And those would be called obvious decisions. And SHM is not necessarily useful at that early stage. But we see a shift in the peak of the savings costs towards lower gap length as the risk aversion increases. That's not surprising. And that's because, of course, a risk in risk aversion, an increase in risk aversion, it decreases that critical threshold of the gap beyond which it's obvious to the human decision maker that the gate is damaged. And the SHM does not offer much benefit. Okay, so this is, you see that risk seekers have tremendous cost savings a little bit later. Risk averters have a little bit of cost savings early, but maybe not enough to warrant investment. So knowing something about how a human would interpret the SHM data might make a big influence on the total investment in an SHM system. So some last couple things I'll show you. So basically, you can map out, you can use this framework to map out the kind of, figure out the kind of space that your organization or your decision maker sits in by essentially answering the following question. So given an SHM system design and those base endpoint consequence costs, what is the range of SHM system cost for which it's feasible over the lifespan of its usage? That's a useful decision that managers want to know. And so that's what these plots are. And essentially, any point on the graph gives a coordinate for the cost combination, cost of the SHM system, cost for maintenance and operation of the SHM system. And you can see where you are based on the risk profile. Okay, so an SHM system with a cost CZ and maintenance and operation is feasible if it yields, of course, a risk to reward ratio bigger than 1, or if you chose to maximize the arithmetic mean instead of the geometric, the traditional metric. And an SHM system with a cost belonging to the region below the classifier would therefore be a feasible design. Okay, so as the intensity of the risk aversion behavior increases, the flexibility to choose an SHM system decreases. Okay, the more risk averse you are, the more you are conservative, the flexibility to choose an SHM system that's cost efficient goes down. Okay, and that makes sense. For an SHM system to be feasible, where maintenance decisions are expensive, you know, it must cost less, and that's a reality. But these are the kinds of analyses that help a business owner, a structural owner, decide on that investment portfolio. And so, I think you're going to hear a lot about a value of information tomorrow. But what we're trying to all do is solve this problem: is when is information gathering economically possible? We've talked about the importance a little bit of optimizing over the life cycle and showing how different decisions convolved with different risk perceptions lead to different savings at different amounts of times and bias the amount of savings over the life cycle. And probably one of the newer things in here in this kind of presentation is that we're starting to bring in this idea again of risk bias, risk perception bias, instead of just looking purely at a risk neutral kind of decision. Because at the end of the day, people are still usually the ones making, have final decision-making authority over maintenance and other actions on the structural life cycle. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. As I said, I didn't take 2 hours, which is probably good. Anything, I'm happy to just have any discussion or questions or thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so we can thank you for your talk. Very important. At the beginning of your talk, Sebastian Todd arrived, so he was looking for the building at the beginning, so he's there now. So we have a lecture related to the value of information. So I don't know if you have questions. Yes? Yes? No, I think it works.
Take down my glasses. So, first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Todd for being here. It is my great pleasure, privilege of taking place in your presentation. And it is really an informed, impressive presentation, which is talking about the state of art in decision making. I also came across your book, Structured Health Monitoring and Machine Learning Perspective, which is considered one of the industry reference, really, and with a lot of information. My question is, as you know, Doctor, decision making right now has been transitioned from intuitive decision making to data-driven decision making. Mm-hmm. However, in order for us to have a data-driven decision making, it significantly depends on how reliable my data is. So, if even though my data is very reliable, there is some skepticism among the predictive model or among the decision making that is based on the predictive modeling, such as artificial intelligence. So my question for you, as an academic researcher, how far you trust the values or the results coming from the artificial intelligence, which is in your slide number 15. And secondly, as an engineer also from other side, from industry side, how far the business owners trust the results coming from machine learning, whether it is a traditional or modern deep learning. So this is my question for you.
Yeah, well, okay. So there's a couple of pieces of your question, and I'll try to answer carefully. So yeah, I first of all, you ask about reliability, and that's an excellent question. And I didn't consider that today, but one other area of research that's very important, when we were trying to estimate these posterior distributions, let me see if I can find, posterior distributions you see for the damage state here. Underneath this estimation is information about the reliability of the system as well. I didn't talk about it at all, but what we also model in this posterior, either model based on prior data or is the reliability of the system itself. Are the sensors capable of performing and giving you unbiased information themselves, or are they failing, partially failing? And maybe if that's what you're referring to about reliability, you're exactly right. Trusting your sensor network is extraordinarily important. And so you have to put in some kind of understanding, maybe it's just a probabilistic model itself, of the ability of your sensors, your network, to give you information that you think it's giving you, that it's supposed to give you. And we actually have life cycle models of the sensor system itself buried in this analysis. I know I didn't talk about it because it's a detail, but it's a whole separate talk. I could give you another hour lecture on that. If you're using data to make a decision and you're using machine learning to separate a boundary, we didn't do that explicitly here, but that's very common. And as you mentioned, we have a book that talks about this. It's very, very common as data become available, to draw boundaries. The key to always remember is machine learning is terrible at extrapolation. It's terrible. Never trust it. Meaning, when data are presented to any decision space that is outside of the bounds of its training, you cannot trust it. You might get lucky, but you cannot, okay? And so never use such a model, I would say. I would tell a business owner to be very, very certain in working with an engineer helping them that the machine learner is tested and has a well-defined training set of information, and understand that you can't extrapolate. Now, what we used here, the one big thing that's unknown here in our demonstration to you, of course, is the failure evolution model. We have no idea in reality how the gap will grow in time. We have some physical understanding, but we had to make it a probabilistic growth curve based a little bit on historical information and mostly on educated guessing. But as a consequence of that, we have to convey to our business owner, to our structural owners, to our decision-making organization, the idea of what it means to take a risk. And that's why we've started talking to people we work with, all in terms of risk to reward ratio. They seem to understand that. They don't necessarily care about all these things that go on beneath the supporting algorithms to make the decision, but what they care about is risk to reward ratio or savings or some measure of value of information. That they understand, in my experience. And we're lucky in my case that the Army in America here is willing to try this in parallel to what they're doing now. So we can hopefully in a few years show that some of what the assumptions we're making and the life cycle analyses we're doing is actually real. It's useful to them. They aren't using this yet, but they're letting us have access to the decision making that they do for their maintenance, so we can compare what we recommend they do to what they actually do and see if it's helping. So maybe that's too much answer for a simple question, but those are my thoughts.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the lecture. It's very nice to follow your research progress. And yeah, very interesting topics you have been talking about. So my question would be, is there any feedback from the decision makers here, also in terms of risk seeking and risk aversion attitude?
That's a good question. Nice to see you, Sebastian. I would say that by looking back at some decision making that the Army has done, we have basically characterized them as a risk averse organization. They're very conservative in their decision making. The asset management leadership at the very top is very open to becoming more risk-taking because the budgets are flat and they're not using their budgets optimally yet. And so I think they want to see what happens if they can take a more aggressive posture on deferring maintenance, because they think that there's savings to be made. And in fact, some of these results that we showed in this analysis, like essentially right here, you know, they're somewhere over here right now. And we need them to get, I think they want to get over here more. And it seems that the leadership is willing to do that, provided we really demonstrate that the, you know, what the possible outcome, the probabilities are too of if the expected decision is not taken. They're sort of interested not only in the maximum risk to reward ratio decision, but the uncertainty in that decision as well. How much if I choose D0 or D1, how much uncertainty was made, not just the expected value. So that we're optimizing. So I think if we can give them that information, they might be more comfortable to adopt a more aggressive management strategy of their assets.
Do we have another question?
Well, maybe I ask another question. Since we just talked about that the decisions are taken with the expected value, and this is utility theory, this goes to the very basis. So we know that there is distributions, and there could also be a probability that the actual realizations flip the optimal decisions. So how far is the discussion here with the core of army? Because you mentioned it is also about the uncertainties.
I'm sorry, Sebastian, at the very end there, I couldn't hear your question. It was starting to get quiet.
I'm sorry. So how far is the discussion with the decision makers here on accounting for the uncertainties in the decisions or the distributions in the utilities or losses?
Yeah, that's a good question. So where the research is now is mostly in focusing on the uncertainties associated with the costs themselves. It turns out that that's actually one of the biggest sources of uncertainty is we have an unreliable government, an unreliable investment strategy, and they don't know what their maintenance portfolio is going to be. They just know that the only objective function the Army has, and at least this makes it easy, is they are graded. Their ultimate objective is they are rewarded or punished depending on how much economic throughput they get through the rivers, right? That's at the end of the day, that's their objective. They have to get as many metric tons of freight through the river system per day, per unit time, as fast as possible. And so that's how we map their objective into costs and so forth. But where they're really working now with us is allowing us to make those utilities very variable. And in fact, we're even trying some simulations where the utility itself might go from zero investment up to historic maxima with equal probability. So they're trying to get us to simulate all possible investment actions on the behalf of the government, to look to see how those things might affect ultimate decisions. And you're absolutely right that those things have a huge influence on the actual decisions made. The numbers matter. The framework doesn't change, but how you model that utility and where you have uncertainty in those utilities is becoming the biggest driver, the biggest source of uncertainty, at least for the Army. And they're wanting us to look at that carefully right now.
No question. So we are going to thank you again very much for this talk early in the morning for you, and thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation.